I didn't know that all of eastern Oklahoma was dominated by a criminal conspiracy to cheat the Indians out of their property. And when I got into it, I couldn't honestly back out.
Tonight on The American Experience, Indians, Outlaws, and Angie DeBow. Major funding for the series is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by this station and other public television stations nationwide.
Corporate funding for The American Experience is provided by Aetna, Insurance and Financial Services. For more than 130 years, a part of The American Experience.
Indians owned all the land of Oklahoma. They were told that they would own this land and govern it as long as the waters run. But the entire area was dominated by a criminal conspiracy to take the land away from the Indian owners. It had been covered up all those years, and I wasn't going to cover it up again. So I told it, and I named names. Now that's what I think historians should do. I was born on January the 30th, 1890. It was just a year after Indian Territory was opened for white settlement. The very date of my birth is the date of the closing of the frontier. This is a little diary that I started when I was a child. And this happens to be, a typical entry, April 5th, 1898. We went with Papa to burn off the long grass in the pasture, and we picked bunches of grass for him to set fire with. And I got very tired, and Edwin said, girls were always delicate things. Angie DeBow. I always signed those entries, every one I signed. Really, I don't like having to do that. I weigh 115 pounds.
We have come to honor Angie DeBow, noted historian and esteemed author. Throughout her life, she has sought the truth and written it. She has portrayed the nobility and the plight of the Indians, the rapid and humble beginnings of white settlement, the courage and faith of the pioneers, the oil boom.
And here with us this afternoon, we have our beautiful queen of the Prairie City Days, Dr. Angie DeBow.
I have written the worst things about Oklahoma than anybody that ever touched a typewriter. But nobody seems to hold it against me.
But there once was an attempt to keep Angie DeBow from publishing the truth about the history of Oklahoma. That history began with the opening of the last frontier, the Oklahoma Land Run. It was the stuff Hollywood movies and novels would be made of. And it was the legend DeBow would challenge over 70 years.
The western half of the Indian Territory was open for white settlement. on the 22nd of April, 1889. At noon, the signal came.
Any United States citizen over 21 years old was entitled to grab 160 acres, practically free.
The whole area swarmed with homesteaders, railroad builders, and founders of new towns. There just wasn't any limit to their expectations. Enormous expectations. The area that was open for settlement in 1889 is where we are sitting right now. Now, my parents had not gone through this experience. We came 10 years later. I was 9 years old. I rode in the covered wagon beside my mother and my younger brother while my father went ahead with the farm machinery. And I hoped I'd see some Indians, and I was very disappointed because I didn't. All I saw was homesteaders. It took quite a bit to make a raw piece of land support a family. The hot winds killed the corn. That was their starving time.
Crop failure, land hunger, and adventure swept settlers across the continent in the 19th century. By the time the homesteaders arrived in Oklahoma Territory, Indian Territory was the largest piece of land in America, still owned by Indian nations. They were known as the 5 civilized tribes, to distinguish them from the Plains Indians who were hunters, and they owned and governed this rich land communally. But now they were completely surrounded by white settlement, and time was running out.
I didn't know about the 5 civilized tribes because Indian Territory was farther away from the experience of the homesteaders in this area than any part of the world is now. All I knew about the Indians was what I read when I was in public school.
It would be years before Angie DeBow learned of the struggle of the 5 tribes to hold on to their land. Like most American children, her studies focused on white progress.
When I was ready to enter high school, there weren't any high schools. And there just wasn't anything I could do except mark time on the farm. That was one of the most miserable times of my life. I wanted to do something. I wanted to accomplish something. Well, I wasn't even graduating from high school. And then when I was 16, I started teaching in the rural schools around Marshall. And from that time on, I was very content.
DeBow finally graduated from high school at the age of 23. She continued to teach and paid for her own education. Then she left home for the University of Chicago, the best in her field, history.
When I began my graduate work in history at the University of Chicago, my field was international relations. And if I had continued at the University of Chicago, I would have continued in the international relations field. My master's thesis turned out well and was published, which of course gave me a great deal of confidence. But the history field was closed and shut and barred against women. There wasn't anything at all that a woman could do to enter it.
In the 1920s, university faculties were almost exclusively male. And even with a PhD, Angie DeBow would never hold a position in the history department of a university.
All I wanted to do was have a chance to create something instead of just wasting my life. And I simply had to build my career in fields where I did have a chance and I could rise. And I had a fair field and no favors. And I came back home to Oklahoma.
DeBow signed a book contract with the Oklahoma University Press to pursue a new field of study, the history of the American Indian.
I just thought it would be interesting to find out how the affairs of the 5 civilized tribes of Oklahoma were terminated. I didn't know that all of eastern Oklahoma was dominated by a criminal conspiracy to cheat the Indians out of their property, and that this corrupted the legislature also. I didn't know those things were so. Nobody had ever written about that history of Oklahoma. And when I got into it, I couldn't honestly back out.
And so, DeBow embarked on what would be the battle of her life, challenging the accepted version of Indian history and the state's most powerful leaders. It was not the story Angie's professor and friend, Edward Everett Dale, expected her to tell.
Dr. Dale wrote some very nice, lively material, like recollections of life as a cattleman, cowboy recipes, but never anything, that would test the academic mettle, so to speak. Angie was turned the other way.
Dr. Dale got a letter for me from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs that opened every file. There was nothing held back. And I began to discover that official reports were inaccurate. They were putting things in there that were not true.
DeBow discovered that the Dawes Commission, charged with carrying out federal Indian policy, lied about the Indians' reaction to that policy, known as allotment. The policy called for carving up the tribal lands, giving each Indian an individual farm or an allotment. The Indians, recognizing that this would destroy their ancient way of life, were in bitter opposition.
From earliest times, it was a canon from the great holy force above. You will hold your land in tribal common ownership rather than individual. Allotment had been tried earlier, and each time it had resulted in disaster for those who participated in it.
The Dawes Commission established their headquarters at Muskogee, Indian Territory, in 1893. Despite the Indians' protests, the Dawes Commission sent a small army of clerks, field officers, and militia into the Indian nations. They crossed over 30,000 square miles to register every member of the 5 civilized tribes in preparation for allotment. They worked by persuasion, intimidation, and even fraud.
Now, there might have been a fairly good argument in the name of progress or manifest destiny to break up the 5 Indian republics. But they didn't state their motives that way. They represented it as doing all this for the Indians. but they were doing it for the white people.
It was very clear to the tribal government that this was a violation of the treaty rights that had already been established with the United States government, because the treaty guaranteed that we would be able to remain together as a nation.
Over strong tribal objections, the commission issued individual allotments. The Creeks were first, beginning in 1899, then the Seminoles, the Choctaw Chickasaws, and the Cherokees.
There was a good number of people, I think, mostly in the southern part of Creek Nation, who really didn't want anything to do with the allotments. And even up till the time when they closed the allotments, these people refused to have allotments in their names.
A resistance movement sprang up among the full-bloods of most of the tribes. They demanded the right to live under the old treaties. Known as Nighthawks and Snakes, they were living secretly on their ceremonial grounds, unnoticed, until they returned their allotments. Rumors suddenly spread of an Indian uprising. Cavalry invaded the sacred grounds of their camp. The Indians offered no resistance, but nearly 100 men were arrested and carted off to jail in Muskogee. They were sentenced to long prison terms as a warning against further rebellion, and were given allotments against their will. Finally released, the resistance movement went underground. Their allotments sat idle for years.
When I was at the university, I had courses in Oklahoma history, but those courses never mentioned the things that I was uncovering. So I went on with it. I'd spend months at Washington. I would go to the basement of the old Interior building, and there were bundles tied in red tape. Truly, it's red tape. And I would untie those bundles, and I'd take notes. And I just traveled all over Oklahoma. I've done so much driving that I knew where every bad corner was. I knew where every bad bridge was. And I'd spend weeks, months at the Five Tribes Agency over at Muskogee. I began to find out more things, and they got worse all the time.
Allotment opened the door to the Indian land.
And all these white people came in with their anti-Indian feelings.
It brought people from every direction, east, west, north, south, European countries. Indian territory was flooded with outsiders, and they were developing patterns of evasion of federal rules and regulations and tribal rules and regulations in order to get their way. Then came oil.
They gave them allotments and then discovered that they had placed them on top of oil.
There's more than one way to skin a cat, and boy, they found the ways. And under the shadow of legality, plundered the Indian estates.
When the oil was found, the Indians' land produced an enormous amount of legal work. The Oklahoma Indian Land Laws was sort of a Bible to the old-time lawyers in Muskogee County. That was a compilation of all the treaties between the United States and the 5 different tribes. Land was a big point of litigation in the Muskogee Federal Court.
Over 300 attorneys poured into Muskogee, a town of 40,000, just to handle the entanglements over Indian land.
The Federal Court of Eastern Oklahoma had more business than any other district in the United States except the District of New York City.
Now, each Indian had to deal with a written system of private ownership. Contracts, deeds, mortgages, powers of attorney, oil leases.
The Federal Court of Oklahoma is now in session. God save this honorable court.
They couldn't sign their name. Most of them didn't know how to read or write English. And they would put their X on the piece of paper and lose their individual land allotment. They would lose their 160 acres.
The full-blood was completely helpless when it came to defending himself before the courts of white society. And they were systematically robbed through the courts.
In less than 20 years, 80% of the land was in white hands. Land worth millions, even billions in natural resources. It was purchased for 5, 10, 15 cents an acre.
When I was growing up, all I heard was the stories about how they lost their land by fraudulent methods. And it always worked towards the downfall of that family. They didn't have anything left once they didn't have any land.
Every citizen of each of these Indian republics received an allotment. So the child received an allotment. But the parents of the child didn't understand the procedures to qualify as guardians. So professional guardians arose who robbed the Indian children.
It was so tempting and so easy, and the risk was so low. You rob a bank and the public wouldn't stand for that, but this other, well, those are Indians. It's a complete disregard for the rights of these people, even little children. God, the orphans.
The Indians had always taken care of their orphans, either by sharing the family life or by orphan asylums, which they established. But the orphans were completely defrauded.
Some of these guardians might pick up 5, 10, 20 orphans, and they'd fight and almost kill one another for guardianship of their allotments.
Speculators searched for names of orphans whose allotments could be placed under guardianship. Lists like this one were supplied to politicians and judges in return for favors.
The most unhappy experience of my life was when I was doing the research for And Still the Water Strong. After oil entered, then it became apparent that an adult Indian was also incompetent, and they needed guardians also. The Bureau of Indian Affairs would collect the oil royalties and turn it over to the guardian. That was the only legal thing they could do. The BIA didn't approve of it, but they never could get it changed. The members of Congress from Oklahoma were always able to prevent it. White people were even murdering oil-rich Indians. John Lewis, a Creek full-blood of excellent character, was killed in an automobile accident August 1st, 1924. He left his heirs, his wife and children, living quietly in Okfuskee County. But great oil production had begun on his Creek County allotment, and at the time of his death, his income was $24,000 a month. A petition was filed to declare the heirs incompetent. There were 8 guardians for the family. Each of the guardians employed an attorney. Hence, there were 16 people authorized to draw fees from the estate, and they robbed the Indians.
The 20s were hard times for the Indian. Part of the rationalization used, they're unworthy anyhow. Many of them are depraved, and therefore they are unworthy of this wealth, and it's there and we'll take it.
By the 1920s, oil had made Oklahoma one of the richest states in the Union. Tulsa, an old Creek tribal town, was the oil capital of the world. Homesteaders now found themselves members of country clubs.
Oil fellow, Gilda. He had lots of money and then went busted. You hear about the abuse of the Indians, and there was some. And they were subject to the prey of avaricious people who would come in and sell them out because many of them had no particular conception of a dollar. They would know more how to handle cattle than they would a bank account. Here in Muskogee, there was a fellow named Haskell that was our first governor that was crookeder than 2 barrels of snakes. But I always like to think they're more honorable people than there are crooks.
Those grafters were among the leaders of Oklahoma society in 1934, at the time I wrote this. And their deeds, their achievements were on the front page of all the Oklahoma newspapers, and the social activities of their wives were on the society page. And so I went ahead and named those prominent people and gave the full story of what they did.
Many of them were still alive, or their heirs. If Dale had known what she was doing, he would have said, "Girl, don't do it." And Angie would have gone full speed ahead.
Senator Robert L. Owen was one of them. Owen did it all. He was wicked. The man who had become the first governor of Oklahoma, Governor Haskell. Chairman of the Dawes Commission was involved.
The very men charged with protecting the Indians grew rich by plundering their land. Senator Owen, by fraud, by misrepresentation, and by using his position in Washington to change the law, became a millionaire from Cherokee, Creek, and orphan allotments. Owen's friend, Charles Haskell, the first governor, was indicted for conspiracy to defraud the Creek Nation. He settled out of court. Tams Bixby The chairman of the Dawes Commission and his entire staff were accused of speculating in Indian land. Following a Justice Department investigation, Bixby resigned.
When I knew what they did and what the honest people that had tried to check it were up against, I had a feeling of fear as I went through those dark corridors and basements and so on. I just had a feeling of fear.
You look at Oklahoma at that time, Indians being murdered, assassinated. I think she was in grave danger.
I went back home with my notes. 1936 was the worst summer that we ever had. The terrible heat and drought. While I was typing, the perspiration used to just run in streams down my face and body. When I would write a chapter, I would read it to my mother. She would say, "Nobody will ever publish that book." But I went ahead and wrote it, and I submitted in Still the Waters Run to the University of Oklahoma Press. And when I sent it to the press, they accepted it and intended to publish it. And Dr. Dale just said, "We are trying to get so-and-so to give such and such to the university, and here he is in this book." He said, "Why should the author go out of her way to express the fact that Oklahoma is dishonest? Such a statement is an indictment upon the whole state. We have enough to defend without inviting criticism. The book is history, and the facts are there, but it is dangerous to write in a book about it. Frankly, I'm afraid of the book." So I violated history in telling the truth. His final decision was that the university should not publish it. It ended up by our tearing up the contract, and I went back to Marshall and hunted a publisher. This frontier area was so remote from educational institutions and knowledge of such things that I was sort of buried there. The fact that I had done good work didn't count very much. That was a period in which I had plenty to discourage me. I had no resources of any kind. I had helped my parents and helped my brother during his last days, but I didn't help them anymore. I wasn't able to help. But I was betting my life, and I mean that literally, I was betting my life on the rather shaky faith that some way would be provided. And so I applied for a grant for my next book, The History of the Creek Indians, The Road to Disappearance. Every bit of the work I was doing was new work.
Angie DeBow was capable of being what we might call a lone wolf.
Well, good morning, Alice.
She just did not require the analysis and criticism of others.
Some cottonseed hulls around the rose bushes. I think it's going to get cold pretty soon. It seemed as though it was taking forever to publish, and still the waters run. And things were just so desperately hard financially.
Oklahoma was hard hit by the Depression, and DeBow was an out-of-work writer with no powerful friends. But she finally was hired by the Federal Writers Project to edit their guide to the state, after 4 candidates turned down the job.
And I naturally wrote the chapter on the history of Oklahoma. But for some reason, after I left, a different chapter was substituted. I never knew who wrote it. but my name is on it. And every page has some horrible, ignorant error. It just makes me feel bad. It still makes me feel bad when I think about this book.
DuBois' chapter on Oklahoma history began, Oklahoma came early under the white man's imperial ambitions. That chapter had been rewritten to stress white settlement. The land was described as vacant, with a few roaming bands of Indians, its potential undeveloped until the homesteaders arrived. Gone was DuBois' emphasis on the struggle for the land between Indians and whites that had engulfed the area for almost half a century. This difference in historical interpretation would continue throughout her career.
Well, now this is my study. I have 5 file cabinets here, and this particular cabinet, it has the notes for Choctaw Republic and Still the Waters Run, 2 of my books. Most of my books were written in this room also. Now these are my notes. I didn't have the advantage of copying machines, and so I had to take all my notes by hand. And they hadn't even invented ballpoint pens, so I had to use a fountain pen.
And Still the Waters Run, the book Oklahoma Press rejected, was finally published by Princeton University in 1940. Angie DuBois was 50 years old.
I received wonderful reviews from scholars. But in Oklahoma, what happens to Indians when their land is broken up didn't attract very much attention, and not the attention that I had hoped.
If you'd ask 100 persons on the street about that book, I doubt if over 1 or 2 would have known us even out. Frankly, I did not know of it at that time. It seems to have not appeared around here too much, probably because some of the local people were pretty well involved in some of it. President of the Historical Society at that time was Robert L. Williams, and he didn't have that book reviewed because some of his lawyer friends were probably involved.
In fact, Williams, guardian of the Historical Society, former governor and federal judge, had himself been named in DuBois' book.
The typical white person would shrug their shoulder and say, "So what?" I think that's what he'd say. I'm sure any of the Indians that read it, they thought, well, that's a good deal. It's at last given the story.
We had lots of copies of Angie DuBois' book at the tribal library because those books were always checked out. Reading Angie DuBois, it was just like, at last, somebody told the story. And there was documentation to back it up.
Everything in it was proved, and everything in it was true, and it was a fact of history. It's the administration of public finance, and it's number 6, and it goes behind this one, and I've got to sit down this very minute.
In some states, she could have rung the bell, got the attention of reform-minded people. But she was just writing in a state of pervasive indifference.
As you know, I get my main meal at noon. The cafe brings me a meal. They bring such generous servings I can't eat it all. So I save some out for supper. And I put out the supper by myself. A spider got in here a few days ago, and she left us some little ones. I have no idea how many tiny spiders there were. I think we got rid of all of them, but I want to be sure that there's not a tiny spider a few days old in that toaster. Of course, I still had the problem of having to get jobs, and so I was working all the time.
To support herself, DeBow returned to teaching, substituting in rural high schools. During World War II, she was pastor at the local Methodist church. Late in her career, she had a full-time job as maps librarian at Oklahoma State University.
But all my spare time, I was at my typewriter.
Angie DeBow wrote 9 books and edited 4 from her home in Marshall, Oklahoma. Her output and reputation rivaled any historian in the West. But her view of Oklahoma history was not accepted there, and recognition came to her almost exclusively from outside Oklahoma.
I wrote articles for Harper's Magazine and many reviews for the New York Times Book Review. Every time they got a book about the frontier or about the West, they sent that book to me.
DeBow emerged as the leading expert on Indian land. When Native Americans took action to regain their lost lands, it was her work that was cited to support their claims. Even the courts accepted her as an authority.
I thought of the federal Indian policy as the true American imperialism. Indians should not have their land pulled out from under them and be left in poverty. Whenever anybody would ask me to speak, I spoke on one subject, the need to establish a new federal Indian policy.
In many respects, she was an eloquent evangelist. It's almost a metaphysical force that I've observed time and time again. That frail little creature and the dynamo that she becomes when she gets before an audience.
I felt if I told the truth, other people could use it. In my book, A History of the Indians of the United States, I have a chapter that says, the white man gets a new chance. Everybody was teaching a course in Indian history in 1970, and everybody wanted it. The book just ran away. They never published but 1 or 2 books that just ran away. One was a farm book. I used the wealth I had acquired on my trip to Egypt. I have always been proud of that picture because the camel turned his head at just exactly the right time. Oh. These are my pictures of Apollo 17. It just happened that I was working on Geronimo, my book Geronimo, at the time of that moonshot. My picture is taken with Jason Betsinus, an apprentice warrior with Geronimo. He came to Oklahoma 5 years before I did, brought here as a prisoner of war. He was 100 years old, and he died a few years after this picture was taken.
This friendship led to interviews with the last surviving Apache warriors who had fought with Geronimo. They provided a rare collection of first-person accounts about the last Indians at war with the United States and of their legendary leader, Geronimo.
I had heard of Geronimo all my life. Geronimo was often advertised as the tiger of the human race, was widely reported as having worn a blanket of human scalps. Of course, none of these wild stories were true.
DeBow had a lifelong fascination with Geronimo. It led to her writing her last book about the most feared Indian in American history. Geronimo became infamous throughout the world as the last hostile leader to resist white settlement. He became a legend when his small band eluded 5,000 soldiers, 1/4 of the entire United States Army.
Nobody could attain leadership among the Apaches that didn't have power. I mean, with capital P, power. And he did have power. In fact, one of his followers said that once when he was traveling and he was in an exposed position and hadn't got to the mountains yet, he delayed the daybreak. And he finished by saying, "I saw that myself, so it must be true." I wrote Geronimo right here on this typewriter. I have outlived several typewriters, but this is my last one.
This man, who was seen as a bloody murderer, DeBow saw as an impassioned patriot defending the tribal cause. At the age of 80, she'd cut through the myths to find the truth.
Now, I started with that fictitious account that General Miles wrote of the great campaign in which he captured hundreds of Apaches. The most mendacious official report I ever read anywhere. He didn't capture anybody.
The Army said they captured the Apaches, but the Apaches said they surrendered. Angie DeBow accepted the Indian account.
As Geronimo told it in later years, we placed a large stone on the blanket before us. Our treaty was to last till the stone should crumble to dust. We raised our hands to heaven and took an oath not to do any wrong or to scheme against each other. The soldiers surrounded them. 16 warriors, 14 women, and 6 children, unarmed and unresisting.
Almost 500 Apaches were rounded up, guilty and innocent alike, packed into boxcars in intense heat. The Apaches' resistance had come to an end.
Thus the whole band, men, women, and children, began 27 years as prisoners of war at Fort Sill in Oklahoma.
Women and children shouldn't have gone to prison, but they did.
These are 2 of my Apache friends, Mr. Benedict Josie and Mr. Moses Loco, grandson of Chief Loco of the Apaches.
Well, this is the kindergarten bunch. That's your sister there.
As a child, I used to hear them talk about always wanting to return to their native land.
DeBow's entire career was devoted to describing how U.S. policies had destroyed the Indian way of life.
There was a lot written about Geronimo, but she tried to bring out things that other writers skipped over. She spoke about manifest destiny, the policy of the government to overcome the Indians because of expansion and increasing of the population. They just had the idea that it was their destiny to rule the North America or the United States. And the Apaches resisted.
Geronimo used these words, "We are vanishing from the earth, yet I cannot think we are useless, or Usen would not have created us." How long will it be until it is said there are no Apaches? 4 years after his death, the prisoners were set free. They numbered only 261. None of them is now living who remembers the hunted existence and the bloody encounters of two nations. I don't believe I thought Geronimo might be my last book. I don't believe I even thought about age at all in those days, although I was in my 80s.
A decade later, in her 90s, Angie DeBow was honored in Oklahoma. Her portrait hung in the state capitol, along with humorist Will Rogers, Indian athlete Jim Thorpe, and several of the state's leaders that she exposed in her books. Almost 50 years after it was written, and Still the Waters Run was published by Oklahoma University Press. The WPA Guide to Oklahoma was reissued with DeBow's chapter restored. For the first time in her career, one of her 9 books was certified for Oklahoma classrooms. It was her only work of fiction.
Dear Charles, I'm so very grateful to you for the genius plus integrity that went into the painting of that portrait. It is not beautiful, that's correct. I have never been beautiful. But it shows the characteristics that I now know dominated my life. It was always there. In fact, my mother saw it in my infancy. Somehow, you captured the whole 95 years. Thanking you, Angie. Postscript. I failed to mention this dominant characteristic. It was drive. It carried me through my whole lifetime. I have tried during these years to sort of bring things to a close. At my age, I don't have too many years to do that in, and maybe not any time at all. I'm going back to those early days, my childhood in Oklahoma. When I was 11 years old, I was thinking about the life that would stretch out before me. I didn't expect it to last until I was 95, but I did think it would last a long time. And I decided to commit that life. And I decided that service and integrity were the important things. That did dominate my choices. And I still think that that is the creative use of a life rather than to try to grab what one can.
Major funding for this series is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by this station and other public television stations nationwide.
Corporate funding for the American Experience is provided by Aetna, insurance and financial services. For more than 130 years, a part of the American